Okay, so Allison Carr wrote, "Failure is not an option, and this is another bad idea about writing." So, of course, since it's a bad idea, Allison Carr does believe, of course, that failure is an option, and she explains why. However, students tend to struggle with this article a little bit because they rush into the first few paragraphs, not really thinking about the big picture, not really thinking about the fact that Carr is refuting the idea that failure is an option. And they kind of get hung up. So let's talk about the different aspects of this article and make sure that you understand where she's coming from. So first of all, the first bit here is the debunking the myth here that failure is not an option. And so she talks about, how society views failure, basically. And look at this really quickly. She says failure is acceptable if we learn from it. That's still a myth. She's not saying that that's when it's an option, is if we learn from it. So be sure and understand that this first opening here is about society's view of failure and how that's a problem. Then she gets into a history of failure, why it's a thing in the first place. And she talks about so you have to understand that while this can apply to other areas of life, she keeps coming back to writing, because obviously that's what we're talking about here is writing. And so in this history, she covers, how literacy became so important, and then how failure kind of derived from this focus on literacy. Look here in this paragraph. She says, given the then corresponding, perhaps correlative rates of illiteracy among incarcerated populations, success and failure in this realm came to be perceived not simply as an indication of intelligence or economic advantage, but as a matter of moral fiber. To fail in reading or writing meant a failure of moral fortitude. So this is all historical here. This is how we came to have these cultural attitudes about failure. And some of you may be able to remember the No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, these programs, standardized testing, they all support this idea that failure is not an option. Finally, at the bottom of page 77, Carr presents her alternative view. How else can we look at failure? She says here in the first bit, what we have failed to grasp, why the idea that failure is bad needs to die, is the integral connection between failure and risk, creativity and innovation, not to mention emotional and cognitive resilience. All right, so she's showing us that there is this connection here, that failure is connected to people that take risk and that are creative and that are innovative, okay? And then she points out, so remember in good articles, good research, you're going to be able to see the evidence. We're not simply relying on what the author is just telling us. She's going to show us with her evidence. And so the evidence that she first provides are all these different discoveries or inventions that happen because of failure. So imagine us living without penicillin, cornflakes, Post-it notes, Corningware, WD-40, oral contraception, and potato chips, okay? All of these things that we depend on daily are all because of mistakes or failures, okay? And she says here, and discoveries like these are the norm, not the exception. In other words, most discoveries are made by accident. All right, I also want to point out, she also talks about fail-con and how failure is starting to be celebrated. And it's not like, you've got to make sure that you have the right attitude about this. It's not like we need to strive to fail. We just need to appreciate it and realize its role in creativity, in success. And then she gets here, so we're kind of always circling back to writing. And she reminds us, she's using some ethos here, that she is a writer and writing teacher. And so she is lending credibility to this topic. And she says here, I would argue that it is impossible for one to develop anything approaching a good writing ability without years, decades probably, of repeated failure. And she comes down and she says writing is learned slowly over a long period of time. And then she provides more evidence for us. She talks about Ta-Nehisi Coates and his views. She talks about Stephen King and how he was rejected 14 times before Carrie was picked up to be published. And we all know that happens to be a movie made multiple times at this point. And other authors here talking about the failures that they sustained before they saw success. So providing more evidence based on writing here. All right. And then her next section is called Making Failure an Option. Now, let's get this really straight here. She has just come from where she's referenced a bunch of authors and their successes after failures. Now she's switching the gear and just talking about the idea, the theory of making failure an option. So she does reference Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell is an author. He is. But that's not why she's talking about him. She's talking about him because he has this proposed 10,000 hour rule, which he suggests that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to master anything. And she also references our Carol Dweck and growth mindset. So I want you to start, thinking about as you're writing and how that connects to growth mindset. We're going to keep coming back to it. But this is part of it. Understanding that failure is not the end. It is just an opportunity for us to grow. And the fact that we're willing to risk failure, does a lot for us in our creativity also. At the bottom of 79, she says, failure is integral to learning and development more so than external markers of achievement or success. An avoidance of failure in learning or in writing or in industry or parenting or any other human community endeavor represents an absence of creativity and an abundance of predictability. Little to no risk, and perhaps even harmful or counterproductive thinking. Here she talks about, look at this, normalizing failure. Make it normal. Make it where people are not scared of it. Make it where people understand that it can promote creativity. And she ends her conclusion, failure and a willingness to fail often in large, obvious ways should always be an option.